Esteemed editor, I hope you will advise me in my present difficulty. I am a greenhorn, only 5 weeks in the country and a jeweler by trade. I come from Russia, where I left a blind father and a stepmother. Before I left, my father asked me not to forget him. I promised I would send him the first money I earned in America. And when I arrived in New York, I walked around 2 weeks looking for a job, and the bosses told me it was after the season. In the third week, I was lucky, and I found a job at which I earned $8 a week. I worked, I paid my landlady board, I bought a few things to wear, and I have a few dollars in my pocket. Now I want you to advise me what to do. Shall I send my father a few dollars for Passover, or should I keep the little money for myself? In this place, the work will end soon, and I may be left without a job. The question is how to deal with the situation. I will do as you tell me. Your thankful reader, I am.
The answer to this young man is that he should send his father the few dollars for Passover. Since he's young, he'll find it easier to earn a living than with his blind father in Russia.
Dear editor, I am one of those unfortunate girls thrown by fate into a dark and dismal shop, and I need your counsel. Along with my parents, my sisters and brothers, I am from Russian Poland, where I was very well educated. But because of all the terrible things happening in Russia, we were forced to immigrate to America. I am now 17 years old, but I look younger, and they say I am attractive. A relative talked us into moving to Vinland, New Jersey. And in this small town, I found work in a shop. And in this shop, there is a foreman who is an exploiter. And he sets the wages on the work. He figures it out so that the wages are very low. He insults and reviles the workers. He fires them and then hires them back. And worse than all of this, despite the fact that he has a wife and several children, he often allows himself to have fun with the girls he makes advances to. And woe to any girl who doesn't willingly accept them. Though my hard-earned dollars mean a lot to my family of 8 souls, I didn't want to accept the foreman's vulgar advances. He started to pick on me, said my work was no good, and when I proved him wrong, he began to shout at me in the vilest language. He yelled at me in Yiddish and in English so the American workers could understand too. And as if the devil were after me, I ran home. I am without a job. Imagine my circumstances and that of my parents who depend on my earnings. The girls at the shop were very upset about the foreman's vulgarity, but they didn't want him to throw them out too, so they were afraid to witness against him. What can be done about this? I beg of you to answer me. Sincerely, a shop girl.
Such a scoundrel should be taught a lesson that could be an example to others. The girl is advised to bring out into the open the whole story about the foreman, because there, in the small town, it shouldn't be difficult to have him thrown out of the shop and for her to get her job back.
Worthy editor, I often spend time with a group of 40 people, 30 men and 10 women. Among them are religious and non-religious people, and we do not pass the time in idle discussions. Recently, we read a report in the newspaper about giving women the right to vote. And for the past few weeks, we've been carrying on a debate about it. I am one of the group in favor of giving women full rights, but most of the others are against it. The opposed argue that it would be very bad to let women get to the ballot box, because that would destroy her family life. The women would then no longer be a housewife, a mother to her children, the wife to her husband. In a word, everything would be destroyed. A woman must not mix in politics, they say. She was created to be dependent on man, obey him, love him, supply all his comforts, and be a mother to his children. The question arises, must the woman then be considered a slave and the man the master? Isn't it obvious that women in many cases show themselves to be cleverer than men? These same people who recently celebrated the 100th birthday of Abraham Lincoln for having freed the slaves now talk with a satirical grin about women's freedom. Just as the opponents of the socialist movement point out that socialism will be harmful, so those who argue against voting rights for women say that this will destroy family life. This is not so, because a woman is a human being, just like a man. The capabilities that women have already shown confirm this. Plenty of facts can be cited from the past. And if women are recognized as human beings, they must also be granted all the rights of human beings. And I think that if women are considered human beings with all their rights, then family life would be better and richer. With socialistic regards, LV.
The arguments against the opponents of women's rights are very good ones. The fact is that many intelligent women are already taking part in various activities and they still remain excellent homemakers. Justice can only reign among people when they all have equal rights. If one has more power than the other, it leads to injustice. Those men who are opposed to giving women the same rights they possess are acting from tyrannical instincts because they actually want to rule women.
Dear editor, since I do not want my conscience to bother me, I ask you to decide whether a married woman has the right to go to school 2 evenings a week. My husband thinks I have no right to do this. I admit that I cannot be satisfied to be just a wife and mother. I am still young and I want to learn and enjoy life. My children and my house are not neglected, but I go to evening high school twice a week. My husband is not pleased. And when I come home at night and ring the bell, he lets me stand outside a long time intentionally and doesn't hurry to open the door. Now, he has announced a new decision. Because I send out the laundry to be done, it seems to him that I have too much time for myself, even enough to go to school. So from now on, he will count out every penny for anything I have to buy for the house, so I will not be able to send out the laundry anymore. And when I have to do the work myself, there won't be any time for such foolishness as going to school. I told him that I'm willing to do my own washing, but that I would still be able to find time for study. When I'm alone with my thoughts, I feel I may not be right. Perhaps I should not go to school. I want to say that my husband is an intelligent man, and he wanted to marry a woman who was educated. The fact that he is intelligent makes me more annoyed with him. He is in favor of the emancipation of women, yet in real life, he acts contrary to his beliefs. Awaiting your opinion on this, I remain your reader, the discontented wife.
Since this man is intelligent and an adherent of the women's emancipation movement, he is scolded severely in the answer for wanting to keep his wife so enslaved. Also, the opinion is expressed that the wife absolutely has the right to go to school 2 evenings a week.
Worthy editor, my biography is similar to those of so many other Jewish people from Lithuania. To Cheder at the age of 5, had a good head for learning, was religious, then became an unbeliever, and later a Zionist. In time, I felt that it was not enough to think only of my own people, and my heart beat with love for the downtrodden of all nations. I was also arrested as a revolutionary several times, and after that, my parents sent me away to America. 17 years have passed since I parted from my parents, but I still see before me my father in his anxiety and feel my mother's hot tears on my face. My heart pounded with joy when I saw New York in the distance. It was like coming out of the darkness when I left my town. I came to the big city where I sensed the freedom, and I became a proletarian. I looked up several friends who were with me in the revolutionary movement, but I was very disappointed in them because they had lost their old spirit and their ideals. Now they were only interested in a steady job with good wages and had no time to bother with the old-time foolishness. I had overthrown the God of my parents and now saw just how petty and paltry my new gods were. I left New York with its sweatshops, took a bundle of goods, went west, and was no longer a proletarian. After a few years, I married a very pretty girl, and for a short time, my wife, whom I loved dearly, was everything to me. I thought I had finally found my peace and happiness. Then came my greatest disappointment. I was in business, and I got involved with my wife's brother and a good friend of hers. When a fire broke out in my store, they tightened a noose around my neck. My wife and the two of them gave evidence that I had set fire to my store to collect the insurance. I served 2 years and 9 months in the penitentiary, but I swear on the memory of my parents, who are no longer living, that I am innocent. I went into prison with a clearer conscience than those that sentenced me. And when I found out that my wife was among those who plotted my downfall, I lost all interest in life, and my heart grew cold as ice and hard as stone. Meanwhile, my wife had divorced me, and when I got out of prison, I considered either throwing myself into the river or becoming a drunkard to forget. 4 years had passed since I got out of prison, and do you know where I now find my consolation? In the old Gemara. Call me an idiot or whatever you want, but the Talmud takes me away from all earthly things and makes me forget everything they did to me. When I'm absorbed in the Talmud, I forget my loneliness and sorrow, and my room turns into a palace where I am king. I'm a man in my 30s, and I'm thinking of returning now to my remote Lithuanian town to bury myself in the Talmud, in the corner of the old shul, and there live out my years. What is your advice? With thanks and respect, LD.
In answer to the writer of this letter, it is said, the solace and inspiration he now finds in life lies not only in the Talmud, but mainly in the memories of his youth. Further, it would possibly be good for him to go to his old town. Not that he would find peace there, but he might be reawakened and feel the urgency to tear himself out of the darkness again, to run back to the free world and start anew.
Worthy Mr. Editor, I was born in a small town in Russia, and my mother brought me up alone because I had lost my father when I was a child. My dear mother used all her energies to give me a proper education. A pogrom broke out, and my mother was the first victim of the bloodbath. They spared no one, and no one was left for me. But that wasn't enough for the murderers. They robbed me of my honor. I begged them to kill me instead, but they let me live to suffer and to grieve. After that, there were long days and nights of loneliness and grief. I was alone, despondent, and homeless, until relatives from America brought me over. But here, my wounded heart found no cure either. Here I am lonely too, and no one cares. I am dejected, without a ray of hope, because all my former dreams are shattered. A few months ago, however, I met a young man, a refined and decent man. It didn't take long before we fell in love. He has already proposed marriage, and he is now awaiting my answer. I want to marry this man, but I keep putting off giving him an answer because I can't tell him the secret that weighs on my heart and bothers my conscience. I have no rest and am going out of my mind. When my friend comes to hear my answer, I want to tell him everything. Let him know all. I have bottled up the pain inside of me long enough. Let him hear all and then decide. But I have no words and can tell him nothing. I hope you will answer and advise me what I can do. I thank you, a reader.
In the pogroms, in the great Jewish disasters, this misfortune befell many Jewish girls like you. But you must not feel guilty and not be so dejected because you are innocent. A man who can understand and sympathize can be told everything. If your friend is one of these people, and he really loves you, he will cherish you even after he learns your secret. Since we don't know your friend, it's hard for us to advise you whether to tell him everything now or not. In this matter, you must take more responsibility on yourself. You know the man, and you must know, more or less, if he'll be able to understand.
Dear editor, I am the grandmother of a 21-year-old girl, a girl with all the finest qualities, and I am writing to you about our problem with her. Our granddaughter met a boy about 6 months ago, a boy a few years older than she. They fell in love and are already talking about marriage. The boy is very refined, from a good and wealthy family. He will be graduating from college this year, and everything would be all right if not for a but. Our son and daughter-in-law, the parents of the bride-to-be, belong to a Reformed temple and brought up their daughter in the same tradition. Her boyfriend, however, comes from an Orthodox family who conform strictly to the Jewish code. In his home, the phone is not answered on the Sabbath, and on Friday night, the electricity is controlled by an automatic clock. To our granddaughter, all of this was new and strange, but when she fell in love with the boy and began visiting his home, she came to love his way of life. It has gone so far that she does not ride on Saturday or eat meat at her own home because she knows her mother does not keep a kosher kitchen and even wants to reform her parents. Well, since my husband and I are not Orthodox either, she's been complaining to us. She would like her boyfriend to be able to eat in her home. And this means that she wants her mother to start keeping a kosher kitchen. There are many quarrels about this because my daughter-in-law won't hear of making such changes. She is generally indifferent to Judaism, and she would prefer to break up the match. The girl is considering moving out of her home because she doesn't want to eat non-kosher food. The question is how to handle this situation, and I ask you to answer immediately. Watching for your answer, Mrs. B.V.
We feel that your granddaughter's boyfriend's strict religious background need not be a hindrance to marriage. The main point is that he's a decent boy and that your granddaughter loves him. And her new belief in Orthodox Judaism should be considered a virtue, not a fault. Your son, daughter-in-law, and the entire family should not oppose the match. When your granddaughter marries the young man, she'll be able to run her own home as she pleases. And she cannot and should not demand of her parents that they should change their way of life for her boyfriend's sake. Your granddaughter and her parents, and even you, must restrain yourselves from giving each other advice on how to live. This is the time for tolerance, and you must all understand it.
Dear Editor, I have often read the Bintel Brief to learn how you suggest solutions to the problems of your readers. Now, I would like to tell you my problem.
Zu mir ist gekommen a Cousine, schön wie Gold ist sie gewesen, wie grüne, bäckelig wie reute Pomeranzen, fisselig was beten sich zum Tanzen, bäckelig wie reute Pomeranzen, fisselig was beten sich zum Tanzen, perlig wie Seidenweb gelogte, zähnlich wie perlig getogte, Eigenlijk wie himmelblauw in Frühling, lippelig wie karschelige Zwiebeln. lebedik und freilich jeder Mina. Oh, das so gewähn ist mein Cousina, lebedik und freilich jeder Mina.
Please join me in a round of applause from wherever you are. We are so lucky to have such talent within our JArts TheatreWorks group. Thank you all. We are also most fortunate right now to have an opportunity to dig into what we just saw with Dr. Jonathan Sarna in conversation with director Dori Robinson. If you have questions during the conversation, please share them in the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll answer as many of the questions as time allows at the end. Dr. Jonathan D. Sarna is the Brandeis University Joseph H. and Belle R. Braun Professor of American Jewish History and Director at the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies at Brandeis. In 2018, he resigned as the chair of the Hornstein Jewish Professional Leadership Program after more than a decade of leadership. He is past president of the Association for Jewish Studies and chief historian of the National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia. Especially appropriate for this program tonight, Jonathan was dubbed one of the 50 most influential American Jews in 2004 by The Forward, and he was chief historian for the 350th commemoration of the American Jewish community, being recognized as a leading commentator on American Jewish history, religion, and life. In case you had any doubts that he was the expert with us tonight. Dori A. Robinson is a director, playwright, dramaturg, and educator. She holds a master's degree from NYU's Educational Theater Program, and most recently was director of education for the Greater Boston Stage Company. So now I will turn it over to Jonathan and Dori.
Thank you so much, Laura, for that lovely introduction. And thank you to everyone who is out there who has been watching this program. It means so much to all of us. Dr. Sarna, so wonderful to speak with you right now.
Well, it's a joy to be here. Thank you. And what a great audience.
A great audience. Yes, indeed. So to get us started, obviously, this Bintel Brief really originated during this time, during this great wave of immigration, and people had these ideas of where they were going, which did not correspond exactly with where they ended up. Can you tell us and give us a little bit of context of where they were leaving and what they arrived to?
So the early letters that we heard and the beginning of the Bintel Brief, which begins in 1906, coincides with what we call mass immigration, and it's actually the largest years of immigration, roughly 125,000 Jews coming into this country every year, escaping from pogroms. 1903 was 1903 was the Kishinev pogrom. Sorry, I don't know what happened there, but 1903 was the Kishinev pogrom, which had a tremendous impact in Russia, persuading many Jews that there was no future for them. And in addition, there was the Russo-Japanese War. Many young Jews prefer to come to America than to be cannon fodder in the Tsar's army. So we're starting these questions amidst the most rapid moment, and these Jews have left home. Many of our writers, as you heard, were young. They, all likelihood, will never see their parents again. There's no email. They can't ask their parents a question. Who are they going to ask? Who's going to advise them? They don't even have a rebbe. They don't have a rabbi to ask questions of. And in many ways, that's what the Bintel Brief is going to do. It's going to be, as someone called him, the omniscient father. And our actor certainly acted that way. He's being Abraham Cahan, had immigrated in 1881. So by 1906, He'd been in America for 25 years. He knew the country. He understood it. He'd worked on an American newspaper with Lincoln Steffens, the great editor, before coming back to the Forward. They looked to him as someone who is older, more experienced, more Americanized, can truly tell them what to do. And he's not shy about telling them.
He is certainly not shy whatsoever. You touch upon, obviously, the theme that rises to the top is questions, certainly questions while going through a moment of change. Can you tell us a little bit more about how questions were answered back in the old country versus, as we've already talked about, here in the new country? And also, to your knowledge, what impact Abraham Cahan is obviously a very outspoken, progressive individual. To what degree do you think he had sort of an impact on the culture and society of American Jews, specifically in the Lower East Side or elsewhere?
Sure. So Abraham Cahan's impact is vast. The newspaper was the largest foreign language newspaper in America. In this period, it had editions in major cities, including Boston. It has vast influence, really, in Europe as well. There is no parallel mass Yiddish newspaper that matches the Forward. And of course, in Eastern Europe, newspapers were subject to deep censorship, which shaped what they wrote. None of that is the case in America. Moreover, Cahan has been influenced by what we call new journalism. He's willing to write about a lot of subjects that would certainly not have been written about in the kind of elitist Hebrew newspapers that were so important, Hamagid and so on, in Europe. It's totally different.
Yeah, totally different. In fact, you hit upon something there. The Forward is, in fact, a very forward-thinking newspaper, and Abraham Cahan did indeed speak about things that were not spoken about, both in the old country or maybe even in other places in the US. Other than chutzpah, what do you think enabled this to be the case?
Well, as I say, he did work with Lincoln Steffens and newspapers, partly to appeal to women, partly to get better audiences. Newspapers were a beginning in America to have these kinds of columns. Some will remember confidential chat in the Boston Globe, which in some ways was similar, except you didn't have an omniscient editor. You assumed people would respond. But I also think that Cahan very much understood that this is what immigrants needed. And to some extent, he was a kind of secular Rebbe. Some of his earliest writings before the Bintel Brief, he gave a column on the weekly Torah portion from a proletarian point of view, a kind of proletarian commentary. And his kinds of questions, I mean, Jews are all about asking questions. I got a kasha. We even have many words for whether it's a shaila, a kasha, is it a difficult, deep question? Is it the kind of question that goes in the Bintel Brief? English doesn't separate, Hebrew does. And Jews were used to back and forth questions and answers. This was deeply ingrained in the East European mentality. He's taking that idea and kind of bringing it to a new world with different kinds of needs and questions, and turning it into a very successful column.
Indeed, he really did, and there's something so special about that, the ability to move on, to take the heritage that we have and move forward with it, progress with it in this new world. Yeah, really wonderful points. Thank you, Dr. Sarna. I believe that we have a few questions from the audience now. Laura?
Absolutely do. So the first question that a few people have asked is actually, why was this column discontinued?
Well, it lasts a long time. Of course, Cahan dies. And remember, it's a Yiddish paper. Now there is an English language forward. But for a long time, the paper was a Yiddish paper, and its audience got older and older and older. And the reason that the Forward Association began to produce an English paper was they realized pretty soon they wouldn't have any readers left. They still produce something in Yiddish and are proud of it, but as the paper changed, the editors felt, maybe the questions are of a different sort. They're not as popular with readers and so on. Of course, as we saw at the end, the new Forward has just brought back these questions. My friend Shira Talushkin is answering them, and they, do talk about the time. I'm going to the home of an Orthodox rabbi. Do I have to wear a skirt? And not something that would have been asked in 1906, but something that speaks very much to the present moment.
Thank you. And I find it fascinating that this really was the beginning of this tradition of advice giving. So if any of us know Ann Landers or Dear Abby, it comes directly from this tradition, which I think is fascinating.
Right, and people may not realize they're both Jewish. I mean, they were these twin girls from Sioux City, Iowa, if I'm not mistaken. Not so much of Jewish culture comes out, and they certainly knew the tradition of asking questions, and they fall into it. But the very fact that both of them assume these American names show us how there's a kind of interaction between old Jewish forms, new American forms, and even though Jews knew that they were Jewish, they ran these very successful American columns, also handling rather intimate kinds of questions for readers, and each decade tells you something about the issues of that decade.
So the next question to follow would then be, two people asked this, were there ever readers who gave responses or follow-up?
Yeah, he occasionally would get pushback from readers if they disagreed with the editor. That's not so much found in Metzger's book, because he had to take the best of the questions, the best of the answers. But over the long span, there were sometimes people who disagreed. Remember that in some ways he was quite socially conservative, although in other ways, many other ways, deeply progressive. And it does come through that on women's rights issues, and they wrote more of the questions than men did, he was very sympathetic and we would say ahead of his time.
It's interesting that you note that, because a number of people have asked about the Cahan's voice or the editor's voice and noted that it really sounds sympathetic in a very feminine way. And I think that's really interesting.
I would like to say that it could be his voice. I also want to say that it's perhaps has something to do with Stuart Hecht's performance, because the man that played our editor was in fact also very sympathetic. So, but yes, of course, the text itself is very dearly sympathetic too.
I mean, Cahan certainly knew how to fight with people as well, not in this column, but if you read other columns in the paper, he would famously fight with Yiddish writers and so forth. But it seems to me that in this column, he understood his readers, and in a way, you couldn't have built a newspaper like the Forward if you didn't have an almost intuitive understanding of who your readers were, what they wanted, what they were looking for. And that very much comes through, I think, in the column.
Absolutely. So, Dori, we actually have a question for you, which is, there are so many letters from so many years. How did the TheatreWorks group and you select the letters? And the follow-up question is this a precursor to a bigger theatrical project? And what might that look like?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a great question. The TheatreWorks came together this spring once COVID really started, and we were really asking ourselves the question of what theater really translates on Zoom. You know, if theater is so much about connection, how can that translate to this Zoom world we're now in? Someone had the wonderful idea about a Bintel Brief, because letters, and that way a person is solo and does not need to be in the same room as someone else. And everyone was asked to simply read a Bintel Brief and read as many of the letters as possible and come back with the ones that really spoke to them. And that is what's so fascinating about this, is that despite the fact that these letters were written 100 years ago or more, so many people connected to the themes and brought up, well, this one is speaking about feminism, and this one is speaking about this repressed shop girl, and this one, everyone was connecting to something. And sort of the ones that people connected to the most rose to the top, and we selected from that. And in fact, each of the actors very much connected with their letters. And that's one of the wonderful things about these connections that we have from back then and from today. In terms of where it will move forward, we did not anticipate this wonderful turnout that we have today. And that really tells us something. It tells us something that people are very excited about this. It tells us something that people are excited about Jewish theater, about Jewish culture, about Jewish connection, about theatrical connection. So that's certainly something that TheatreWorks is going to think about, and we're all going to brainstorm on, because clearly that's something that's wanted and needed, and that we certainly are excited about.
That's great. So the next series of questions is about language, because as we know, this was a Yiddish newspaper and we just performed this in English. So can we talk a little bit about, the translation and when and where and how that happened?
I think that Isaac Metzger translated them himself as we move forward, of course, and you see that with one of your sponsors, the Yiddish Book Center. Everybody is able to speak English. The immigrant generation may have struggled, but the next generation, if they knew Yiddish, they knew English as well. And he realized that he could translate these into an American idiom. And remember, it was a bestseller, a phenomenon as a bestseller when it was first published. And as far as I know, it's never gone out of print since Metzger's book appeared. So, he did a very good job And I think we see lots of Yiddish translation. Somehow Yiddish translates into an idiom that people often can sympathize with and read. And actually, it's worth noting, Cahan himself was purely bilingual. Cahan's novel, The Rise of David Levinsky, is still, written originally in English, the best novel of the Jewish immigrant experience in America ever written, and has also been in print continuously for 100 years. It really is remarkable. But these letters were written in Yiddish. Sadly, we don't have the archive. One wishes that all of the letters had been preserved. Then we could see which he printed, which he didn't print. There are people who believe that he wrote some of the letters, and certainly dear Abby admitted that she sometimes wrote a letter which she wanted to answer. And it would be, but we have no idea about who wrote the letters and how he decided which would most appeal to the audience.
It's wonderful that you touched on that, Jonathan, because there's a couple of questions about forgeries and about basically how much truth there was to these questions.
They rang true, and when you have 100,000 readers, if it didn't ring true, they would notice. So this poor woman, it probably was the Ukraine following World War I, the civil war in Russia. The only thing both sides agreed upon was to kill or rape Jews. And the story of the post-World War I crimes were devastating. We've forgotten it because of the Holocaust, but everybody at that time knew, and there were many children who came to America, and it was also easier to get into America if you were an orphan, as this poor girl was, and that story certainly rings true. As I listened again to these, one after another had the ring of truth, but it is certainly believed that occasionally he heard something or had a conversation with somebody and then turned it into a letter, which is true of all advice columnists, as I understand it.
Absolutely. So the next kind of genre of question I'm seeing is relating to immigration. Since this column no longer exists, what would you say, or is there a comparable sort of column or columns these days, whether it be blogs, newspapers, otherwise? What would you say immigrants or people who are new to the U.S. might look to today?
Well, as you hint, lots of immigrants do today have circles online, have groups, and you can see all sorts of questions similarly asked in their own language where you're familiar. What should I do? Remember too, they didn't have a telephone for most of those years. Now people had folks also that they could call and ask some of these kinds of questions. But I think the enduring popularity is due to the fact that many of the questions are enduring. They're questions that are asked over and over. Some of them are questions related to immigration. Some of them are questions relating to relationships, to the interaction of men and women. human beings have changed less than we imagine over the past century. And these are human dramas, and that's why, indeed, they appeal to us.
That's great. Okay, so before I throw it back to Dori, we have one other question. You touched on this, but someone is asking, do the original letters exist somewhere? Is there some kind of archive of some of them? I know you mentioned not all of them.
Well, the entire forward is going online at, so if you know Yiddish, you can go online. I think it's both through the New York Public Library and also through what's called JPress, which brings together lots of Jewish newspapers. And the dream, long term, is to use Google Translate in connection with this so that you'll be able to get some help in translating this. And there are people trying to teach Yiddish to Google Translate so that it will work. That is really thousands and thousands of letters. And indeed, a smart person could even go and talk about the kinds of letters and the kinds of subjects using quantitative techniques. But I'm not aware of the original letters as they were sent to the forward office surviving. And I don't believe that they do survive, but there have been articles and doctoral dissertations that have looked at a much larger group of Bintel Brief letters than Metzger translated. So you could spend the rest of your life reading 100 years and learning a lot from Bintel Brief letters.
Thank you. That's
so true.
Really
it's
interesting.
So true. We've already learned so much from it. Sorry, Laura.
No, go ahead, Dori, please. I know you had a final question.
Well, my final question, spur of the moment, Dr. Sarna, as we've talked about so much throughout today, and of course throughout a Bintel Brief, is about questions. So might you, Dr. Sarna, have a kernel of advice for us during this time of COVID when we're separate from one another, perhaps about in general or about staying connected, or a little piece of wisdom you want to leave with us?
I'm a historian, and we've been through hard times before, and we've come through those hard times. And I have to say, I think for American Jews, some of the immigrant period, the world wars, those were even harder times. The Great Depression, even harder for many people than we have now. That may not make the suffering feel better, but it's a reminder in every case they ended and then better times returned. And that lesson, the lesson of hope, seems to me a lesson that all of Jewish history teaches us. That's why we're still here.
And on that beautiful note, that couldn't be a better way to end this evening. Thank you so much, Jonathan. Thank you so much, Dori. This has really been wonderful. And I can tell you, based on comments and questions from our audience, I think we'll have a next iteration and extension of this program. And we have a lot of questions about whether we might do it in Yiddish. So I think we have what to think about here. So thank you all for chipping in your ideas, because like we said, this is a new initiative of our TheatreWorks group, and we're excited to see where it can go. So I am indebted to the two of you for kicking this off so beautifully. I also want to just name all of the people in our TheatreWorks group and say a huge thank you to Annette Miller, Avital Shira, Barbara Wallace-Grossman, Dori A. Robinson, Stuart Hecht, Jesse Garlick, Josh Luckins, Lindsay Allen Cox, Shoshana Narva, Rebecca Smith, and Wendy Lebo. Without all of their brain power, talent, and time, we would not be here right now. And of course, a huge thank you to our partners at the Yiddish Book Center, who I said 30 years, they are actually celebrating 40 years this year. So it's a really special year for them. The National Yiddish Theatre Folksbiene, as we said, and to the Forward, who has a special treat for all of us tonight. As part of this partnership and for your being with us tonight, all attendees can receive an exclusive subscription offer, 25% off your subscription, plus a free Bintel Brief ebook. And if you already subscribe, you can still get the free ebook. So we'll send more information in a follow-up email. We are so glad to have been with you tonight. And this program and all JArts programs are made possible by generous community support by people like you. So if you enjoyed this program tonight, I do hope you'll join us in making future events like this possible, other Bintel Brief readings and more. Please consider making a gift at JArtsBoston.org. Again, a huge thank you to our TheatreWorks group. Dori, Jonathan, thank you so much. This has been wonderful. Thank you all for being here, and we hope we'll see you soon.